Everything's gone. 20 years, all gone. I'm standing in my pajamas at 3 a.m. watching my house burn, while my HOA president neighbor films everything with her phone. Chloe Green isn't calling 911. She's recording my devastation like a trophy. This psycho terrorized my family for months over grass 3/10 of an inch too tall, and now she's crossed an unimaginable line. But Chloe made one massive mistake destroying my life. She has no idea who she's messing with, and my secret is about to flip everything upside down. When the truth comes out, she'll wish she'd never heard my name. If you've been bullied by a power-hungry neighbor, drop a comment. This revenge story will restore your faith in karma. You know that neighbor? The one who treats the homeowners association rules like they're the 10 Commandments handed down from Moses himself. Well, meet Chloe Green, 5'4" of pure suburban tyranny, wrapped in a designer tracksuit and armed with what I swear was military-grade measuring equipment. I'm talking laser levels, digital calipers, and a clipboard that she carried like a weapon of mass destruction. Every morning at exactly 7 a.m., she'd emerge from her pristine colonial house, looking like she was about to conduct a NASA launch, when really she was just planning to make my life absolutely miserable over 2.8 inches of grass. That's right, 2.8 inches. See, according to the Maplewood Heights HOA bylaws, Section 4, subsection 12, grass height couldn't exceed 2.5 inches. And Chloe, she took this rule more seriously than most people take their wedding vows. Picture this. It's a beautiful Saturday morning in June. I'm out there with my coffee admiring my lawn that frankly looked pretty damn good when I hear this mechanical clicking sound. I turn around and there's Chloe squatting next to my mailbox with what looks like a laser rangefinder, taking measurements like she's surveying for a new highway. The woman actually had a professional-grade laser measurer, the kind contractors use, and she's pointing it at individual blades of my grass while muttering numbers under her breath like some kind of suburban Rain Man. 2.8 inches, Mr. King, she announces, standing up and brushing off her knees with this theatrical sigh that could have won her an Oscar. The regulation is 2.5. And then, I kid you not, she starts taking selfies. Actual selfies with my grass in the background, posing with that clipboard like she just discovered a new continent. This is what I deal with every single day, she's saying to her phone, apparently recording a video for what I can only assume was her personal collection of neighborhood violations. Because nothing says I have a fulfilling life, quite like documenting your neighbor's lawn infractions for posterity, right? But here's where it gets really good, or really bad depending on how you look at it. 3 days later, I get this certified letter in the mail. Official HOA letterhead, Chloe's signature at the bottom, and a bill that made my coffee cup literally slip from my hands. $2,500 for special infrastructure assessment, plus $100 per day in fines until my grass situation was brought into compliance. $2,500 for grass that was 3/10 of an inch too tall. I mean, I've seen people get smaller fines for actual crimes. So naturally, I did what any reasonable person would do. I marched myself down to the next HOA meeting, ready to fight this ridiculous charge. The meeting was held in the community center, one of those beige buildings that seems designed to suck the soul out of anyone who enters. About 30 residents showed up, which was actually a pretty good turnout for Maplewood Heights, and there's Chloe at the front table like she's chairing a congressional hearing. She's got charts, people. Actual pie charts showing neighborhood compliance statistics and property value impact assessments. Who makes pie charts about grass height? Seriously, what kind of person has that much time on their hands? When I stood up to contest the fine, explaining that 3/10 of an inch was within any reasonable margin of error, Chloe literally pulled out a folder. I'm talking a thick manila folder, labeled with my address. This woman had been documenting my property for months. Photos of my trash cans on non-collection days, measurements of my fence height, even pictures of scuff marks on my mailbox post. She'd turned harassment into an art form. Democracy means majority rules, Mr. King, she said with this smile that could freeze hell over. You're outvoted. Next, like I was some kind of minor inconvenience instead of her neighbor of 8 years. But then I noticed something interesting. In the corner of the room, there's this guy in an expensive suit, definitely not from the neighborhood, shaking hands with Chloe after the meeting. I caught a glimpse of what looked like blueprints or property maps, and I could swear I saw my street highlighted in yellow marker. Later I found out this was Michael Ross, some big-shot developer who had been quietly buying up houses in our area. Turns out 47 out of 48 houses on our block had already sold to his company. Guess who was the holdout? Yeah, that would be me. Suddenly, that $2,500 infrastructure assessment was starting to make a lot more sense. The really twisted part was learning how the whole scam worked. Jake Morrison, the HOA treasurer, let it slip during a conversation at the local coffee shop that board members got infrastructure bonuses when major development deals were completed. Translation, they were getting kickbacks for pushing residents out so Ross could buy up the entire neighborhood. My grass wasn't 2.8 inches because I was a bad neighbor. It was 2.8 inches because I was standing between Chloe and a very large payday. Inside that same certified packet tucked behind the assessment notice, and the threat of a lien was something that made my blood run cold, a plain unmarked sleeve holding a single printed photo of my house. A red X slashed across the siding, and 2 words were block printed under it: pay up. Whatever this started as with grass measurements, it had moved into something uglier. Someone wanted me gone, and Chloe Green had just made it clear how far she was willing to go. You know that feeling, when someone crosses a line so far that you almost can't believe it's actually happening. Well, buckle up, because Chloe was just getting started. 2 days after I got that charming little photo of my house with the red X, I wake up to my phone buzzing with notifications from our neighborhood group chat. You know the one, Maplewood Neighbors, where people usually post about lost cats and recommend plumbers. Except this morning, it's lighting up with messages that made my stomach drop faster than a broken elevator. Anyone else notice the King family having financial troubles lately? Posted by an anonymous account created just minutes earlier. Then came the avalanche. Messages about how my property taxes were supposedly delinquent, how I'd been seen arguing with bank representatives, how there were rumors about foreclosure proceedings. Complete fabrication, every single word, but you know how these things work. Throw enough mud at someone, and some of it's going to stick. Within an hour, I had neighbors walking their dogs past my house, slowing down to stare like I was some kind of cautionary tale about suburban financial ruin. But the real fun started when I tried to leave for work that morning. I'm backing out of my driveway, running a few minutes late because I'd spent the morning taking screenshots of all those fake posts so I could report them, when suddenly there's this loud bang on my trunk. I slam on the brakes and look in my rearview mirror, and there's Chloe Green standing directly behind my car with her arms crossed, like she's about to stop traffic on the freeway. Not beside my car, not near my car, behind my car, blocking me from backing up any further. "You're not leaving until we settle this," she announces loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. And of course, because the universe has a twisted sense of humor, this is the exact moment that Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down decides to take her morning jog, and Mr. Chen starts walking his golden retriever, and the Hendersons' teenage son chooses to wait for his school bus right at the corner, where he has a perfect view of the whole spectacle. Within minutes, I've got an audience of about a dozen neighbors, and half of them are pulling out their phones to record whatever's about to happen. "Chloe, I need to get to work," I say, trying to keep my voice calm while my heart is racing. Because what do you do in this situation? Do you call the police? Do you get out and physically move your neighbor? Do you just sit there and wait for her to get bored and leave? She's standing there in her coordinated workout gear, and I mean perfectly coordinated, like she color matches her shoelaces to her water bottle, looking like she's prepared to camp out behind my car until the end of time. "Your work," she says, with this laugh that sounds like nails on a chalkboard. "What about my property values, Daniel? What about the neighborhood standards that the rest of us are trying to maintain?" And then she turns to address our impromptu audience like she's giving a campaign speech. "This is what happens when people don't follow the rules, everyone. This is why our community needs strong leadership." I'm sitting there watching my neighbor conduct what amounts to a public rally in my driveway, using my car as a literal hostage to make her point. That's when she pulls out her phone and starts calling the police. Not because she's in danger, not because there's been any actual threat or confrontation, but because she wants to create a scene that makes me look like the aggressor. "Officer, I'm being threatened by an unstable neighbor," she says into the phone while I'm still sitting in my car with the engine running, literally doing nothing except trying to get to work. He's been acting erratically lately, and I'm genuinely concerned for everyone's safety. Yes, I'll stay on the line. The police show up about 15 minutes later. 15 minutes during which I'm trapped in my own driveway, while Chloe gives interviews to neighbors like she's some kind of war correspondent reporting from a dangerous combat zone. When Officer Miller arrives, Chloe immediately switches into victim mode. Gone is the aggressive stance and the commanding voice. Suddenly, she's this concerned community member who's just trying to protect the neighborhood, from an increasingly unstable resident who's been having financial difficulties and taking his frustrations out on law-abiding citizens. "Officer, he's been under a lot of stress lately," she explains with this perfectly practiced tone of sympathetic concern. "Financial troubles, you know how it is." And when I tried to have a reasonable conversation with him about some minor property issues, he became very agitated. "I'm just worried about escalation." The woman deserved an Academy Award for that performance. She managed to paint herself as the reasonable neighbor and me as the unhinged threat, all while standing behind my car, preventing me from leaving my own property. Of course, by the time I finally got to work, an hour and a half late, my boss was already asking questions about why I'd missed an important morning meeting. "We can't have employees with legal troubles, Daniel," he said after I tried to explain the situation. "Maybe you should take some time off, get your personal matters sorted out." One phone call from Chloe had managed to sabotage my professional reputation along with my neighborhood standing. But here's the thing that really should have been a red flag. As I was finally pulling out of my driveway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My brake pedal felt spongy, like there wasn't enough pressure in the system. I pumped it a few times as I approached the busy intersection at the end of our street, and that's when I realized the horrible truth. My brakes were completely gone, and I was rolling toward 4 lanes of morning traffic with no way to stop. You know how they say that in moments of crisis time seems to slow down? Well, they're absolutely right. As my car rolled toward that intersection with dead brakes, everything became crystal clear in the worst possible way. I could see the school bus approaching from my left, packed with kids heading to Maplewood Elementary. To my right, the morning commuter traffic was moving at about 40 miles per hour. And straight ahead, a concrete retaining wall that was looking more and more like my final destination. I'm pumping that brake pedal like I'm trying to strike oil, but getting absolutely nothing except the sickening feeling of metal hitting metal with no hydraulic pressure whatsoever. That's when I heard the honking. Not just regular honking, but this frantic, desperate sound that cut through my panic like a fire alarm. I look in my rearview mirror, and there's this pickup truck bearing down on me, horn blaring, and the driver is waving his arm out the window like he's trying to flag down a runaway train. It was Pete Parker, my neighbor from 2 streets over, the guy who had always seemed like the most normal person in our increasingly insane neighborhood. Pete was the kind of neighbor you could actually have a beer with a divorced dad who was just trying to keep his head down and take care of his 12-year-old daughter Emma. The next few seconds played out like something from an action movie, except with a lot more terror and a lot less cool soundtrack. Pete pulled up alongside me, still honking, and I could see him shouting something through his window. I couldn't hear what he was saying over the sound of my own heart pounding, but I could read his lips well enough to understand, jump out, now." But here's the problem with jumping out of a moving car, even a slowly moving car rolling toward an intersection. You're probably going to end up as roadkill, which doesn't really solve the original problem of not wanting to die. Pete, though, had apparently thought this through better than I had. He pulled ahead of me and started slowing down, positioning his truck so that when my car inevitably hit something, it would hit his tailgate instead of a school bus full of children or a concrete wall designed to stop runaway vehicles. The man was literally using his own truck as a cushion to save my life, and all I could think was how I was about to completely destroy his vehicle and probably bankrupt him in the process. Because you know what's worse than brake failure? Brake failure that ruins your neighbor's life while you're trying to save your own. The impact wasn't as dramatic as it sounds, more of a crunch than a crash, really. My car hit Pete's tailgate at maybe 15 miles per hour, which was just enough to finally bring me to a stop without turning either of us into pancakes. But the sound it made, that grinding, scraping noise of metal folding in on itself, was absolutely sickening. I sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Pete was out of his truck before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, pulling my door open and checking to make sure I wasn't hurt. "Dan, are you okay? Are you hurt anywhere?" he kept asking while helping me out of what was left of my car. And here's the thing that got me. Pete seemed genuinely more concerned about my well-being than about the fact that I'd just destroyed the back end of his truck. His tailgate was completely caved in, his rear bumper was hanging at a weird angle, and there was brake fluid from my car dripping all over his license plate. But all he cared about was making sure I hadn't been injured in the collision. "Someone sabotaged your brakes," he said after taking a look under my car. "This wasn't mechanical failure, Dan. Someone cut your brake lines." The way he said it sent chills down my spine because Pete Parker wasn't the type of guy to jump to conspiracy theories or dramatic conclusions. He was a plumber by trade, the kind of practical, straightforward person who dealt with facts and evidence, not wild speculation. If Pete said someone had deliberately sabotaged my car, then someone had deliberately tried to kill me. That's when the reality of the situation really hit me. Chloe hadn't just been harassing me about grass height or even trying to force me out of the neighborhood. She'd escalated to attempted murder. Standing there in the middle of that intersection, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 vehicles and the sound of sirens approaching, I realized that my HOA president had just tried to murder me, and my neighbor Pete had quite literally saved my life by sacrificing his own truck in the process. "She's dangerous, Dan," Pete said quietly while we waited for the police and fire department to arrive. "Chloe's not just power-hungry or greedy, she's actually dangerous. This whole thing is escalating way beyond what any normal person would do over a property dispute." He showed me Emma's photo that he kept in his wallet, his daughter smiling at the camera in her school photo, gap-toothed and innocent. "I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you. Promise me you'll be careful. I have a feeling she's just getting started." As I gripped Pete's hand and thanked him for saving my life, I realized that in a neighborhood where everyone else had either turned against me or was too afraid to get involved, Pete Parker was the only real friend I had left. The man had risked his own safety and destroyed his own property to save mine, and I owed him everything. Looking back now, that moment of gratitude would make what happened next so much more devastating than I could have ever imagined. 3 weeks after Pete saved my life, I was having trouble sleeping. Not because of stress, well, not entirely because of stress, but because every little sound in the night made me wonder if Chloe was escalating her campaign of terror. Every time the house settled, every time a tree branch scraped against the window, every time the neighbor's cat knocked over something in their yard, I was wide awake listening for footsteps or the sound of someone tampering with my car again. Linda kept telling me I was being paranoid, but when someone's already tried to kill you once, paranoia starts feeling a lot like common sense. It was a Thursday night in late July when everything changed. There had been a storm warning all day, one of those summer storms that builds up slowly and then hits like a freight train. The power had been flickering on and off since around 9 p.m., and by 11:30, we were getting lightning strikes close enough to rattle the windows. I was lying in bed reading some legal briefs by flashlight when I smelled something that didn't belong in our bedroom. It wasn't the smell of rain or ozone from the lightning. It was plastic, burning plastic, and it was getting stronger by the second. I got up to investigate, thinking maybe something electrical had shorted out during one of the power surges, when I heard a sound that I'll never forget. It wasn't loud, more like a whisper really, but it was distinctly wrong. Woomph, like someone lighting a barbecue grill, except we didn't have a barbecue grill in our basement. I grabbed Linda and told her to get dressed immediately, that we needed to get out of the house right now. She started asking questions, but I could already see orange light flickering under our bedroom door. Our house wasn't just on fire, it was already completely engulfed. Getting out was like something from a nightmare movie. The hallway was filling with smoke so thick I couldn't see 3 feet in front of me, and the temperature was rising so fast that the air itself felt dangerous to breathe. I grabbed my laptop bag and our important documents, the kind of things you grab when you know you're never coming back, while Linda got our emergency cash and medications. The whole process took maybe 90 seconds, but it felt like hours. By the time we made it outside, our neighbors were already standing in their yards watching our house transform into what looked like a massive bonfire. Mrs. Sullivan from next door was recording everything on her phone, which at the time seemed kind of ghoulish, but would later turn out to be incredibly important. The Hendersons had called the fire department, and Mr. Chen was asking if there was anything they could do to help. And then right on cue, here comes Chloe Green appearing out of nowhere, like some kind of disaster vampire ready to feed on other people's misery. She drifted in with that stagey concern she wore like perfume, one hand clutching a clipboard and the other pressing a small 2-way radio to her ear, the clear acoustic tube disappearing behind her hair. "Daniel, Linda, oh my God, are you both okay?" she said. Not filming, just moving from neighbor to neighbor, like a floor manager whispering what to say if anyone asked what they'd heard or when they'd noticed the smoke. "Emphasize the smell around 10:45, she murmured to Mrs. Patterson, then prompted Mr. Chen to mention flickering lights. What bothered me even then was how prepared she looked for a supposed emergency wake-up hairset robe, cinched just so, reflective armband catching the strobes from the first engine, as if she'd been waiting for her cue. Most people stumble outside in chaos. Chloe arrived with bullet points. The fire department arrived within 10 minutes, but by then it was too late to save anything meaningful. Our house, the house where Linda and I had lived for 20 years, where we'd hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties and anniversary celebrations, was gone. Not damaged, not partially destroyed. Gone. When the flames finally died down around 4 a.m., we were looking at a foundation and nothing else. 20 years of memories, photo albums, family heirlooms, and irreplaceable mementos had been reduced to ash and twisted metal in less than 3 hours. But the nightmare was just getting started. Around 6 a.m., while Linda and I were sitting in the Red Cross emergency shelter, trying to process what had happened, Fire Inspector Rodriguez approached us with an expression that made my stomach drop. "Mr. King, we found something in the debris that we need to discuss," he said, pulling out evidence bags that contained what looked like pieces of metal and fabric. "We discovered accelerant residue in multiple locations throughout your basement, and we found this container with your fingerprints on it. My fingerprints. On a container of accelerant, in my own basement. I'm looking at this evidence bag trying to understand how my fingerprints could possibly be on something I'd never seen before when Rodriguez drops the next bomb. Mr. King, based on the burn patterns, the accelerant placement, and the physical evidence, we believe this fire was deliberately set. And unfortunately, the evidence suggests it was set by someone with intimate knowledge of the house layout and access to the building. That's when the police arrived, not to take statements or offer assistance, but to place me under arrest. Daniel King, you are under arrest for arson in the first degree and insurance fraud," Officer Miller announced while pulling out handcuffs that felt like ice against my wrists. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I'm standing there in clothes I'd grabbed during our emergency evacuation, watching them load me into the back of a police car while my house smoldered behind me and my wife cried on the sidewalk. But here's the part that really showed me how deep this conspiracy went. As they're driving me away, I see Pete Parker's truck pulling up to the scene. He gets out looking shocked and concerned, immediately going over to Linda to offer comfort and support. I can't believe Daniel would do this. He's telling everyone who will listen. He's a good man. There has to be some kind of mistake. The perfect concerned friend defending my character while I'm being hauled away in handcuffs. And standing right next to him, nodding along with his every word, is Chloe Green playing the role of sympathetic neighbor while secretly orchestrating my complete destruction. The local news van arrived just as we were pulling away from what used to be my street. The reporter set up with the burned-out foundation behind her and rehearsed a lead-in that made my stomach turn. A suburban judge in cuffs, an alleged fraud, a neighborhood stunned. Mrs. Sullivan's footage was already making the rounds, and now the narrative had a broadcast voice to carry it. Have you ever tried to rebuild your entire life from a budget motel room? Let me tell you, it's exactly as depressing as it sounds. The Sunrise Inn, which hadn't seen a sunrise that wasn't filtered through decades of cigarette smoke and broken dreams, became our temporary home while we waited for the insurance company to decide whether they were going to pay our claim or use my arrest as an excuse to deny everything. The neon sign outside our window flickered between vacancy and vacancy all night long, which somehow felt like a perfect metaphor for how empty and broken everything had become. Linda was falling apart, and I don't mean that in some dramatic over-the-top way. I mean she was literally having chest pains from the stress, which meant emergency room visits we couldn't afford, medical bills we couldn't pay, and credit cards that kept getting declined because our bank had frozen our accounts pending the outcome of the arson investigation. 4 days after my arrest, while I was out on bail wearing an ankle monitor that beeped every time I got within 50 feet of a restricted area, Linda collapsed at the pharmacy trying to fill her blood pressure medication. Stress-induced hypertension, the doctor said, caused by prolonged exposure to traumatic circumstances. But you know what the really sick part was? Pete Parker was there for us through everything. Every single day he'd drive by the motel to check on us, bring us coffee and groceries, offer to help with phone calls to insurance companies and lawyers. The man had become our lifeline in what felt like a sea of people who had either abandoned us completely or were actively working against us. When Linda needed to get to her medical appointments, Pete would drive her because our car had been impounded as evidence. When I needed to meet with my attorney, Pete would offer to watch our stuff at the motel because we couldn't afford to lose what little we had left. What I didn't know was that Pete was also sending regular updates to Chloe about our daily activities. Text messages like, "D looks completely broken today," wife crying constantly, "mission accomplished," with responses like, "keep watching, make sure he doesn't try to run." While I thought I was confiding in my closest friend about how devastated and hopeless everything felt, Pete was actually conducting surveillance and reporting back to the person who had orchestrated our destruction. The man who had saved my life, who'd been our rock during the worst period of our lives, was working for the enemy the entire time. I found out about the betrayal in the most horrible way possible. Pete had come by for one of his regular check-in visits, bringing Emma's latest drawing that she'd made for Mr. Daniel to help him feel better. It was a picture of our family standing in front of a house with the words, "Everything will be okay," written in purple crayon across the bottom. Emma was such a sweet kid, 12 years old, gap-toothed smile, completely innocent in all of this. And she'd been sending me drawings and get-well cards because her dad had told her that I was going through a difficult time. While Pete was showing me Emma's artwork, his phone kept buzzing with text messages. Normally, he'd just ignore them or step outside to respond, but this time he was looking at the screen while we were talking, and I happened to glance over at exactly the wrong moment. Or maybe the right moment, depending on how you look at it. The message was from C, and it said, "How's our boy holding up? Still looking defeated." Our boy, not your friend or Daniel or your neighbor. Our boy, like I was some kind of shared project between them. "What does that mean?" I asked, pointing at his phone screen before he could lock it or delete the message. Our boy, who's C, and why are they asking about me like I'm some kind of pet project? Pete's face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, panic, guilt, resignation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. Like he'd been carrying around this horrible secret for so long that getting caught was actually a weight off his shoulders. "She has Emma," he said quietly, sitting down on the motel bed like all the energy had just drained out of his body. "Chloe has custody leverage over me, and she's been using it to make me spy on you for months. The brake sabotage, the evidence planting in your basement, the fingerprints on that accelerant container, all of that was me. I did all of it because she threatened to take my daughter away permanently if I didn't cooperate." The confession that followed was like getting punched in the stomach repeatedly while someone explained the mechanics of each blow. Pete told me everything. How Chloe had used her real estate connections to influence the family court judge in Pete's custody case. How she'd manufactured evidence of his instability and poor judgment to get Emma's visitation reduced to supervised visits only. How she'd promised to reverse all of that if he helped her get rid of the neighborhood problem, meaning me. The brake lines, the accelerant planting, even saving you from the car crash, all of it was part of her plan, Pete said with tears streaming down his face. "She told me to build your trust by being the hero who saved your life, and then use that trust to destroy you completely. I planted evidence in your basement during every helpful visit I made. Every time I came over to check your plumbing or fix something around the house, I was actually setting you up for this arson charge. But the worst part, the part that absolutely shattered me, was when Pete explained the brake sabotage. She told me to cut your brake lines, but not completely, just enough to make them fail at a specific time. Then I was supposed to rescue you, become your hero, and use that gratitude to get unlimited access to your house for evidence planting. I realized that Pete hadn't saved my life out of friendship or human decency. He'd saved my life because it was part of a larger plan to destroy it more thoroughly later. Sitting there in that awful motel room, listening to the only person I thought I could trust, explain how he had systematically betrayed me. For months, I understood that Chloe Green hadn't just burned down my house. She'd burned down my ability to trust anyone ever again. 3 weeks after Pete's confession, I found myself sitting in the strangest place I could imagine, the defendant's gallery of my own courtroom. Well, not as the defendant, obviously, but as the victim watching my neighbor get arraigned for arson conspiracy and about 6 other felonies that the district attorney had managed to pile on after reviewing all the evidence. It's a weird feeling seeing your own workspace from the perspective of the people who usually stand before you, asking for mercy or pleading their case. The judge's bench that I'd occupied for 15 years suddenly looked massive and intimidating from down here in the gallery seating. Chloe walked into that courtroom wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, flanked by Marcus Smith, one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the county. She looked confident, composed, almost bored, like this whole proceeding was just a minor inconvenience that would be cleared up as soon as the adults in the room started talking sense. She'd posted the $50,000 bail without blinking, apparently, and her real estate empire was still generating enough income to afford top-tier legal representation. In her mind, I think she still believed she was going to walk away from this with maybe some community service and a fine. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and Judge Patricia Hayes took the bench. Patricia was a colleague of mine, someone I'd worked with for years on various judicial committees and community outreach programs. Under normal circumstances, seeing her walk into my courtroom would have been perfectly routine. But these weren't normal circumstances, and the first thing she had to address was the massive conflict of interest sitting right in the middle of the proceedings. "Before we begin," Judge Hayes announced, "the court must acknowledge that this case involves allegations against Judge Daniel King, who normally presides in this courtroom. Judge King has filed the appropriate recusal motions, and this matter will be handled by visiting judge assignment for the duration of proceedings. Judge King, you are present today as a victim and witness not in any judicial capacity. Is this understanding clear to all parties?" That's when it happened. That's when Chloe Green finally realized exactly who she'd been messing with for the past 6 months. I watched her face change as Judge Hayes explained my role in the proceedings. First confusion, then recognition, then this horrible dawning understanding that the annoying neighbor she'd been systematically torturing was actually a 15-year veteran of the county court system. The quiet guy who just wanted to trim his grass and live peacefully was the same person who had been sending criminals to prison for a decade and a half. Marcus Smith was frantically whispering in her ear, probably trying to explain why this was very, very bad news for their defense strategy. Threatening, harassing, and attempting to murder a sitting judge carries significantly higher penalties than doing the same things to a regular citizen. The federal charges alone could put her away for decades, and that's before you get into the state charges for arson, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and witness intimidation. I could see Smith doing mental calculations about plea bargains and damage control, while Chloe sat there looking like she'd just realized she'd been playing chess with someone who was actually a grandmaster. The state's attorney, Jennifer Walsh, laid out the evidence with the kind of methodical precision that makes defense attorneys wake up in cold sweats. The video footage from Mrs. Sullivan's security camera showing Chloe and Pete approaching my house on the night of the fire. The accelerant analysis proving that the fire was deliberately set with materials that had been strategically placed for maximum destruction. Pete's signed confession detailing months of conspiracy evidence planting and witness intimidation. Text message records showing coordination between Chloe and Pete throughout the entire operation. But the really damning evidence came from the financial records that the investigation had uncovered. Email correspondence between Chloe and developer Michael Ross discussing final obstacle removal dated the day before my house burned down. Bank records showing payments from Ross's development company to Chloe's real estate business contingent on neighborhood acquisition completion. Insurance paperwork showing that Chloe had taken out additional policies on neighboring properties, betting that a tragic fire would reduce property values enough to force more sales to her development partner. Your Honor, Walsh continued, the defendant orchestrated a months-long campaign of harassment, intimidation, and ultimately arson against a sitting judge in an attempt to force him from his property for financial gain. The defendant used custody leverage against an accomplice, planted false evidence, sabotaged the victim's vehicle, and finally burned down an occupied dwelling while the residents were sleeping. This represents a clear and ongoing danger to the community and warrants detention without bail. Smith tried to argue for reasonable bail, claiming that his client was a pillar of the community with deep local ties and no history of violent crime. But it's hard to argue someone isn't dangerous when they've literally tried to murder their neighbor over a property dispute. Judge Hayes set bail at $500,000, which sounds like a lot until you realize that Chloe's real estate business was worth several $1,000,000 and she had assets hidden in multiple states. The really beautiful moment came when Smith tried to argue that his client couldn't possibly get a fair trial in a courthouse where the victim was a sitting judge. Your Honor, he said with what I assume was supposed to be righteous indignation, my client cannot receive impartial justice in a facility where the alleged victim has worked for 15 years and has personal relationships with court staff, attorneys, and other judges. Judge Hayes looked at him with the kind of expression that usually precedes very bad news for defense attorneys. Counselor, she said slowly, your client is accused of attempting to murder a member of this court over a grass-cutting dispute. If your defense strategy is based on the premise that judges shouldn't expect the same protections under law as ordinary citizens, I suggest you reconsider your approach. As they led Chloe away in handcuffs, she turned back to look at me sitting in the victim's gallery. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I smiled. Not a vindictive smile or a cruel smile, but the smile of someone who finally understands that Justice isn't just a concept we talk about in law school. Sometimes justice is watching the person who destroyed your life realize that they picked the wrong target and that their victim has access to resources they never could have imagined. You know what's funny about karma? It doesn't just show up when it's convenient for you. Sometimes it takes its sweet time building up pressure like a volcano before it finally erupts all over the people who deserve it most. 2 weeks after Chloe's arraignment, while she was sitting in county jail, trying to make her $500,000 bail, her entire world started crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. And the beautiful part was watching it happen from the front row. First, her real estate license got suspended pending the outcome of her criminal case, which meant she couldn't legally conduct any business transactions or earn any commissions from her supposedly thriving real estate empire. Then her clients started canceling contracts left and right, because apparently people don't want to buy houses from someone who's been arrested for burning down their neighbor's property over a lawn dispute. Who would have thought that arson charges might be bad for business in the residential real estate market? But the real gut punch came when the district attorney's office started digging deeper into her financial records and discovered evidence of insurance fraud, mail fraud, and wire fraud, spanning back almost 3 years. Turns out the little scheme she'd cooked up with developer Michael Ross wasn't her first rodeo in the creative property acquisition business. She'd been running similar operations in 2 other counties using HOA pressure tactics and manufactured emergencies to force homeowners into selling below market value to her development partners. The federal charges alone were enough to put her away for 25 years to life, and that's before you factor in the state charges for arson of an occupied dwelling, conspiracy witness, intimidation, and attempted murder of a public official. Her attorney, Marcus Smith, was probably billing her about $5,000 a day just to read through all the evidence the prosecution had gathered, and every page made her situation look more hopeless. That's when the plea bargain conversations started getting serious. Jennifer Walsh, the prosecutor, offered Chloe a deal that was way more generous than she deserved: plead guilty to arson in the first degree and conspiracy, accept a 10-year sentence with possibility of parole after 7 years, and avoid the federal charges that could have locked her up until she was too old to remember why she was in prison in the first place. It was the kind of deal that defense attorneys dream about when their clients are looking at life sentences. Meanwhile, Pete Parker was getting the cooperation deal of the century. In exchange for his full confession, his testimony against Chloe, and providing access to all their text messages and email correspondence, he was looking at 18 months in county jail, with the possibility of serving most of that time on house arrest with an ankle monitor. The prosecution wanted Chloe more than they wanted Pete, and they were willing to be very generous with someone who could deliver the main target wrapped up in a bow. But here's what really sealed the deal for Chloe. Her business partner and former best friend Kelly Harmon completely abandoned her the moment the criminal charges became public. Jennifer had been Chloe's partner in the real estate business for 8 years, and they'd built what appeared to be a successful company based on aggressive marketing and neighborhood networking. When Jennifer found out about the arson charges, though, she didn't just distance herself from Chloe. She threw her under the bus and backed up over her for good measure. Kelly held a press conference announcing that she was dissolving their business partnership, immediately refunding deposits to all current clients, and cooperating fully with law enforcement to ensure that anyone who'd been defrauded by Chloe's activities would receive full restitution. She painted herself as an innocent victim who'd been deceived by her criminal partner, despite the fact that she'd clearly known about at least some of Chloe's more questionable business practices over the years. The final straw came when Chloe tried to make her one phone call from jail to Jennifer, hoping to arrange bail money, or at least some emotional support from her oldest friend and business partner. Instead, she got a recorded message: "You have reached Harmon Property Solutions. Due to recent events involving our former partner, this business is permanently closed. All pending transactions have been transferred to Hamilton Real Estate Group. If you are Chloe Green, please do not contact this number again." Sitting in that orange jumpsuit in county jail, realizing that her business was destroyed, her assets were frozen, her friends had abandoned her, and she was looking at spending the rest of her life in federal prison, Chloe finally understood that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life when she decided to mess with the wrong neighbor. The quiet guy who just wanted to cut his grass had turned out to be a sitting judge with 15 years of experience in the criminal justice system, and now that system was grinding her into powder. The plea bargain suddenly looked a lot more attractive when the alternative was dying in federal prison. 10 years seemed almost generous compared to life without parole, especially when her attorney explained that federal arson charges involving occupied dwellings typically resulted in sentences that would keep her locked up until she was eligible for Social Security. So on a gray Tuesday morning in October, Chloe Green whispered the three words that would haunt her for the next decade: "I'll take the deal." 6 weeks later, I found myself back in my own courtroom for what might have been the most surreal morning of my 15-year judicial career. Judge Patricia Hayes was presiding over Chloe's sentencing hearing, but make no mistake, this was still my courtroom with my nameplate temporarily covered by a visiting judge placard, my law books on the shelves, and my principles of justice echoing off the walls that had witnessed thousands of similar proceedings over the years. Chloe sat at the defendant's table wearing the same orange jumpsuit she'd been wearing for the past 6 weeks, looking like a completely different person from the confident real estate mogul who'd terrorized our neighborhood with measuring devices and HOA violation notices. Prison had not been kind to her. Her perfectly styled hair was now a greasy mess, pulled back into a sloppy ponytail. Her designer nails were chipped and broken, and the confident posture that had intimidated so many homeowners was now replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who'd finally learned what real consequences look like. The courtroom was packed. Mrs. Sullivan was there, along with most of our neighbors who'd witnessed the months of harassment that led up to this moment. Pete Parker sat in the back row with his daughter Emma, both of them looking relieved that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. Even Michael Ross, the developer who'd been Chloe's partner in the original scheme, was there, though he was sitting with federal marshals since he'd been arrested the previous week on his own set of fraud charges. Judge Hayes called the court to order and asked if I wanted to deliver a victim impact statement before sentencing. This was my chance to tell Chloe exactly what she'd put us through, to explain the real cost of her months-long campaign of terror, and to make sure that everyone in that courtroom understood the difference between a property dispute and attempted murder. Your Honor, I began standing at the podium where so many defendants had stood before me over the years. Chloe Green didn't just burn lumber and drywall when she set fire to our house. She destroyed 20 years of memories, photographs that can never be replaced, family heirlooms that had been passed down through generations, and our fundamental sense of security in our own home. But more than that, she attacked the basic principle that people should be able to live peacefully in their own neighborhoods without fear of violence from neighbors who disagree with them. I talked about Linda's stress-induced health problems, about the financial devastation of losing everything we'd worked for, about the violation of trust that comes with learning that someone you considered a friend has been systematically betraying you for months. But I also talked about resilience, about the community support we'd received from real neighbors, and about the importance of a justice system that holds people accountable, regardless of their social status or financial resources. Chloe Green tried to use money influence and intimidation to destroy my family because we wouldn't participate in her illegal development scheme, I continued. She weaponized the homeowners association, corrupted the legal system through threats and fraud, and ultimately resorted to arson when her other tactics failed. But she made one critical miscalculation. She assumed that her victim was powerless, and that assumption has led her to this courtroom today. Judge Hayes then asked Chloe if she wanted to make a statement before sentencing. Chloe stood up slowly, looking around the courtroom at all the faces staring back at her, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize or show some genuine remorse for what she'd done. Instead, she delivered what might have been the most tone-deaf statement I've ever heard in a criminal proceeding. Your Honor, I want to say that I never intended for things to go this far, she began, which was already a bad start since she'd literally tried to murder us in our sleep. I was just trying to maintain property values and community standards in our neighborhood. Sometimes passionate advocacy can be misunderstood or taken to extremes, and I deeply regret that this situation escalated beyond reasonable discourse. She actually tried to frame attempted murder as passionate advocacy and arson as a misunderstanding. The woman was standing in front of a judge wearing prison clothes, about to be sentenced to a decade in state prison, and she was still trying to spin her crime spree as a neighborhood association dispute that got slightly out of hand. Judge Hayes looked at her with the kind of expression that usually precedes very long prison sentences. Miss Green, she said coldly, the court finds that you showed callous disregard for human life, engaged in a months-long conspiracy to defraud and intimidate your neighbors, and ultimately attempted to murder a sitting judge and his wife over a property dispute. Your actions represent a fundamental threat to the rule of law and community safety. The sentence came down like a gavel striking stone. 10 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 7 years. $485,000 in restitution to the victims. lifetime prohibition from serving in any homeowners association capacity, permanent restraining order preventing any contact with the victims or their families. As the deputies guided Chloe toward the side door, she kept her eyes down until the threshold, then lifted them past me to the empty front row where the HOA board used to sit during our community outreach sessions. Whatever bravado she'd worn for months evaporated there at that vacant seat. No defiance, no plans, just the quiet recognition that the room she tried to bend had closed its doors on her. Walking out of that courtroom holding Linda's hand and heading home to the new house we'd built, on the same foundation where our old house once stood, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not vengeance, not satisfaction, but the simple peace that comes from knowing that justice has been served and that bullies sometimes do get exactly what they deserve.